Welcome to our continuing series of virtual voices focusing on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Today, we have Anna McGovern, who is the Managing Director of Pondview Group, Limited Liability Corporation, a boutique consulting and advisory firm specializing in supply chain, strategic procurement, and operations management. Anna was the Chief Supply Chain Officer for the Food Bank of New York City, having been appointed at the start of the pandemic, where she turned around a troubled operations area facing double the demand. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Dr. Durbak. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Today, the topic that I'll be presenting is the impact of supply chains on ESG, environmental, social, and governance models in terms of how do you create positive social impact, how do you decrease the environmental footprint, and how does that tie into business in general. So if you'll permit me, I'll share my screen and take you through a few slides. I look forward to your questions. Again, thank you for having me. Let me launch right into this. Social impact and CSR, which stands for Corporate Social Responsibility, is at the heart of many companies' business models these days. Many companies have embraced doing good and creating a positive social impact for a simple reason. Doing good and having a purpose-led business is actually very good for business. So there's a positive impact to the bottom line, the top line, but it's also creating good in the world. Let me start by giving you a quote from Sir Richard Branson. He's basically saying that never has there been a more exciting time for us to explore this next great frontier, where the boundaries between work and higher purpose are merging into one, where doing good really is good for business. So this is the theme I'd like to explore with you, because essentially if companies from the top begin to take on this concept of creating a positive social impact, while at the same time reducing the environmental footprint, what happens is you begin to give purpose and give rise to smallholder farmers and giving them the dignity of work, where women who've never worked before have the opportunity to work in places like India and parts of Asia. You're beginning to promote life-saving, healthy habits. And I'll show you that in just a moment about how creating a positive social impact is both good for business, but it's good for the world and our purpose, and why reducing the environmental footprint and taking care of our planet is extraordinarily important. And, fact-based research shows that the fastest growing brands in terms of the economics are in fact purpose-led. So if you start looking at the research, let me give you an example from Unilever, the consumer packaged goods company. It's a global company. And in 2018, 28 of their sustainable living brands, in other words, those brands that were taking action to support a positive change in people and the planet, grew at 69% faster than the rest of their portfolio. And that particular year, they represented 75% of the business growth of the company. So you begin to see this critical intersection between doing good and creating positive momentum from a business standpoint. So what I want to do next is I want to show you a video from one of those Unilever brands. The brand is Lifebuoy, which is a global soap brand. And this is a story in India. So hopefully technology works. I'm going to turn on the video. It's a little under 4 minutes long, but it tells a powerful story. And it really demonstrates why doing good is so important, and the importance of supply chains in making this happen. And we'll get into more of the supply chain agenda as far as ESG. Signal me if you don't hear, but I think you'll be able to hear. There's volume over time.
गाँव में बच्चे बहुत बीमार होते हैं, कोई कहीं घरों में नहीं पहुंचता, इसलिए बहुत तकलीफ होती है। उनसे का बच्चे पहले तो हफ्ते में बीमार पड़ गया, नहीं बचा। क्या लगता है आपको? गाँव में ये कहती है बेटी होगी, पक्का पता है कि बेटियां ही होगी, नाम भी सोच के रखा है, चमकी करके। लड़का हो तो क्या रखे कि चमका? 2 छुट्टियां बांध के भेज दूंगी उसको स्कूल में। व्रत रखेंगे, काला धागा बांधेंगे, मंदिर जाएंगे, लेकिन उसकी आदतें नहीं सुधरेंगी। अब बच्चा पेट से आके थोड़ी बोलेगा साफ सफाई रखो मेरी जान बचा। सब लोग टीवी देखने के लिए मेरे ही घर पे आते हैं, संजय भी आती है।
आई स्कूल पापा छोड़ेंगे। ए आई पहचाना, मैं हूँ तेरी चमकी। ये बस दीपा माक्षी वाली डॉल, आलिया जामुरी फ्रॉक। अरे दो छोटी, लेकिन ये चमकी क्या नाम है? सब लोग हंसेंगे तो। ए आई जग गई क्या? मैं 7 साल आगे से आई हूँ तुझे थैंक यू कहने, और 2 महीने में तो सच्ची आ जाऊंगी छोटी सी, और 7 साल में ऐसी हो जाऊंगी इतनी लंबी। आई रोज रात को पेट पे हाथ रख के गाना गाने के लिए थैंक यू, और खाना बनाने के लिए थैंक यू, स्कूल ले जाने के लिए थैंक यू, मैं रोती थी तो हंसाने के लिए थैंक यू, और सबसे बड़ा थैंक यू साबुन से हाथ धोने के लिए। जब मैं छोटी थी तब तू हर बात पे हाथ धोती थी, सब हंसते थे तेरे पे, पर तू साबुन से हाथ धोना कभी नहीं भूलती थी। इसलिए पहले 28 दिन मुझे कोई भी बीमारी नहीं हुई। भाई तेरी तबीयत को एकदम सुरक्षित रखने के लिए थैंक यू तेरी चमकी।
मेरी चमकी ने जो बताया मैं वही करूंगी।
Okay, I sure hope you got the point of that video. Essentially, this is about teaching the life-saving habit of washing your hands with soap. Right before we started the broadcast this afternoon, Dr. Durbak was sharing with me the importance of sending socks over to the Ukraine because it's so cold. There is a supply chain mission that's involved with sending these socks for the same reason that helping a child in India live to the age of 5, and the reason the children don't live that long is because in these poor outskirts of the large cities in India, there's very poor hygiene. They don't wash their hands, and they get sick with dysentery and other diseases, and a child cannot live to the age of 5. So although selling more soap, okay, is the result of teaching this campaign about the importance of a life-saving habit of washing your hands regularly, it's saving lives and it's selling more soaps. So this is that key message of doing good is good for business, but it's also creating a positive impact. And the supply chain and making that happen is at the heart of all of this. So in the past, supply chains were all about delivering the lowest cost. You know, the mission of the supply chain was about saving 7 to 9% of the total revenue. But now we can incorporate these cost savings initiatives with ESG so that we're channeling the right parts of the supply chain so that we're employing suppliers in the outer ecosystem. So it's a total ecosystem approach of hiring economically disadvantaged businesses, minority-owned businesses, shareholder farmers, certified products that are creating the social impact and reducing the economic and environmental footprint. And you have the ability to embed all of these policies into your supply chain, and I'll get into a little bit more of that. So as we begin to look at the supply chain approach, it's built on 3 pillars of ESG. So it's important to know that governments and the private sector have the capability of creating this positive social impact. And it's built on the 3 pillars of environmental, social impact, and governance. And if you're in a business, manufacturing of any kind, it starts with your organizational strategy. It has to be part of the overall business strategy, which then informs your supply chain strategy. And what happens is if it's embedded in everything you do, you can plan and design for impact right from the get-go. So for example, I've got a client who does microboards, right? And all of their profits, they donate 25% of their profits to villages in Africa that are basically earning less than $2 a week, right? So they're donating this money, they're building schools, they're promoting education, especially for females, right? So here's a private business that's using social impact to be able to create education for young girls in Africa. So you design and you plan for impact, and then you create, NPD here stands for new product development. So you design for value. So if you're creating a bottle of shampoo, as an example, you can maximize and design your formula so that your shampoo is using less water, or you create a dry shampoo formulation. You put it in a bottle that uses less plastic, or maybe you convert from plastic to using paperboard, which is much more biodegradable and doesn't take so long to sit in a landfill. Or maybe you've got a chemical additive that you can champion with academia. You can work with universities to come up with an additive that can help plastic disintegrate much faster. And then you start looking at the total network of the supply chain, which includes suppliers and customers. And you can maximize the network, first of all, by hiring diverse suppliers, economically disadvantaged suppliers, minority-owned suppliers, women-owned suppliers. You give a chance to businesses that can lift up whole communities. You look at maximizing your logistics supply chain. How do you optimize trucking so you have less trucks on the road? Therefore, you're emitting less carbon gases and less fuel. How do you maximize your warehouses so that you're minimizing waste or eliminating waste and reducing the environmental footprint? These are the actions, and I'll begin to take you through how you begin to look at that from a holistic standpoint. So holistically, you've got to look at business sustainability and how you use the supply chain together in order to do it, while at the same time aligning your strategy with risk management. Okay, so you're looking at the total values drivers holistically, and then you focus on the end-to-end. That's how, so the supply chain is about the end-to-end ecosystem of suppliers and customers. And you've got to look at each of these nodes across the board, where you've got physical movement within the supply chain, and then you've got information flow coming back in the other direction. So together, what you're doing is you're looking at your procurement and your supply management strategy, how you manage materials efficiently, how you move through the physical distribution system, and then your logistics and trucking. Because in each of these steps, you've got the ability to create social impact and reduce your environmental footprint. And then by looking at the total network, you start to look at, what are my opportunities? How do I create a supply chain vision that maximizes social impact and reduction of the environmental footprint? How do I put that strategy into action? How do I create a culture where everybody that's working for me is embedded in environmental, social, and government impacts that are going to promote the health and well-being of societies and the planet? And then you begin to execute on that strategy. And what is the key facilitation? Okay, so within the supply chain, procurement is the key to this, because they are the conductors of the orchestra that are holding the baton, right? They are directing the extended supplier ecosystem. And I'll get into some government statistics and some statistics from the World Bank and from the US government as well. But essentially, by working with procurement and suppliers, there's an added benefit again to the companies that are purpose-led. It does lead to lower cost. It does lead to increased sales. It leads to more competitive innovation ideas. It does reduce the supply chain because you're spreading the risk among many. Okay, there's greater customer loyalty, especially with the millennial generation, the Generation Z. These are consumers and customers that demand responsible environmental governments and private sector corporations to do the right thing. They've got the ability to use social media to either promote companies that behave well and put away companies that don't behave well. And of course, stronger supplier relationships. So if we look at how they do this, what I want to share here is that according to the World Bank, and this is from research directly from the World Bank, there were $95 trillion worth, so USD, $95 trillion worth of purchases by governments, right? And that essentially represents an enormous amount of impact if we can impact $95 trillion worth of purchased goods. And just the US government alone, purchased $600 billion worth of goods and services in 2020. So what does that mean? It means that the government designates that certain suppliers will get access to these purchases, right? So they want to give a chance for women-owned businesses, for economically disadvantaged businesses, for minority-owned businesses, We've got something called hub zones, where there is just simply economic misfortune, high unemployment rates, right? So the government has this across many different countries in the world, where they've got access to purchasing from suppliers who need the help. And so what happens is, when you're hiring these private sector companies in order to take part in these government contracts, those suppliers now have the ability to hire their suppliers that are in those same classes. So you begin to create this virtual cycle of opportunity. So if I'm a private company and I'm supplying the government, then it is my responsibility to hire the same type of suppliers that are creating that positive social impact. So you begin to drive the economy. You begin to start creating jobs where, you know, there are low opportunities for jobs. You begin to start lifting up entire communities by creating education. I'll give you an example from my own career. Unilever, I worked at Unilever for many years, and Unilever is one of the largest consumers of palm oil. And Indonesia is one of the largest suppliers of palm oil. And so the Indonesian government does not behave very well, and there's deforestation and there's corruption in the government. So Unilever wanted to get sustainably grown palm oil, and they were not having success with the government. So what they did was they took a part of their plan was to invest 125 million in US dollars, and they built a state-of-the-art manufacturing facility in the jungle of Mangkai. It's a region that's on the water in Indonesia. So they built this factory, but it was a total jungle. So what they wound up having to do was to create the entire infrastructure. So not only were they creating a factory, they had to build schools. They had to build hospitals. They had to build homes for the people that they were flying in and hiring. So they started to hire people, train them and educate them, and they created an entire village within Mangkai, which was completely undeveloped. They began to develop it. They created schools and hospitals and infrastructure, etc. And then they started to produce sustainably grown palm trees, right? So these trees were sustainably grown, and then they were harvested to produce palm oil. And so they were putting out 1 billion tons a year of sustainable palm oil, which was used in brands like Dove soap and shampoos and Vaseline lotions, etc., in a sustainable manner that was then driving the sales of these brands because they're sustainably sourced. But what they wound up doing was creating an infrastructure of lifting up an entire community, building schools, building homes, building hospitals, hiring and training. And this is how you use the supply chain to create a positive social impact, right? So I just wanted to give you that one example to show you that they were sourcing government agencies. The government wanted to show that documentation, and it goes back and forth throughout the ecosystem of suppliers, right? And finally, I'm next to, this is the second to the last slide. What I want to point out here is that this is a 5-lever approach to creating value, because it's not just about the supply chain. It's important to take away that it's the responsibility of the private sector. Governments have to incent the private sector to create positive impact. And then companies need to realize that it's at the C-suite. It's with the CEO, the chief executive officer and his team to drive a social impact agenda, a reduced environmental agenda. It needs to start from the top and work as part of the culture to create a purpose-led mission so that we can use the supply chain for good. How do we get things to Ukraine? How do we get things to Syria? I remember during the Syrian war, Doctors Without Borders were in Syria trying to help all of these displaced people that were living in tents and camps, you know, and there were very sick people, and the doctors were being asked, what should we buy? You know, it was an arid environment. It was a dry environment with sand and desert. Do you need blankets? Do you need water? You know what the doctor said? They said, send us Vaseline, because Vaseline petroleum jelly was able to be coated on feet and cuts and hands, and it kept the sand and it kept the dirt out, reducing infection. So that was almost like free advertising for the Vaseline brand. And so what they did was they started to ship truckloads and container loads and boatloads of Vaseline over to Syria, because Doctors Without Borders said this is the most important thing. Just like Dr. Durbak is saying, you know, send socks because they need to keep their feet warm in that environment. Now you got a whole supply chain that's involved with sending socks to the Ukraine. This is how supply chain has an impact on the ESG agenda, right? So you use it in tandem. So it's the finance working with marketing, working with R&D and product development, working with the operations teams and the supply chain, and then procurement, bringing it all together by creating this ecosystem of extended partners that are all working for social good, right? How do we lift up whole communities? And again, this is just a demonstration how it's the organizational strategy that informs the supply chain strategy, which is then working in tandem with manufacturing as well as procurement. And how do we begin to start to impact the entire ecosystem? Okay, so that is the last of my slides. I want to thank you for your attention. If you're listening, I'd be more than happy to take this, questions at this point. Susie, I don't know if you've got any comments. I'll stop sharing my screen, and then let's see if we've got anything I can clarify or anything I can help with. This is something I'm very passionate about, because you can see how this ripple effect is just creating this virtual circle of higher economic conditions, higher impact, creating this uplifting, value of education. People that don't have access now have access.
Thank you very much, Anna, for a very informative and amazing presentation on the effect of supply chain technologies and the focus on its worldwide impact, particularly on women and the disadvantaged, and what is needed to make this world better for everyone. Thank you also for mentioning that many of the new supply chain technologies are keeping their focus on their environmental impact, making it as low as possible. Over to you, Susie.
Thank you, Dr. Durbak, and thank you so much, Anna, for the relevant presentation. I echo all of Dr. Durbak's comments, that super relevant, insightful, and inspiring. Our first question from the audience is, can you give a real-life case example of a company that truly stands out to you as one that has improved their supply chain management while doing good for the environment, people, and their business? I know you gave some examples throughout the presentation, but one that has stood out to you.
Yes, certainly I'd like to mention Unilever. I'm a little bit biased because I used to work for them, but they've been living this agenda for the last 3 decades, so they've always done good, but they've gotten to the point now where they are at zero emissions, right? Zero emissions across their 250 factories in their global network. So they've got 250 factories in their global network. All of them are at zero emissions at this point. And then they're looking at their plastics. So obviously they use a lot of plastic products, and ocean plastic is a huge concern, for the world today. The amount of debris that lands in the ocean, killing wildlife or killing sea life. So we need to reduce the amount of plastics that we're consuming in this world. So they have made a commitment that by 2025, close to 100%, I think it's going to be 85% of their total use of plastic is going to be in recycled, post-consumer recycled, recycled resin, which means that they're recycling plastic as opposed to creating new plastic. They're also shifting away from the petrochemical supply chain more to a plant-based supply chain as they begin to use products and chemicals, so it's plant-based chemicals as opposed to oil-based chemicals, so that impact on drilling is significantly reduced. Essentially what they're doing there is shifting. So this is a global enterprise that can impact a lot. But then let me point to a completely different company, right? So I mentioned Microboard. This is an American-based company. It's a very small company. It's a family-owned business that's like third generation. They're called Microboard. They make, circuits, and they make circuit boards essentially, for the industrial industry, the industrial manufacturing space. They take 25% of their profits and it goes directly to Africa, as I mentioned, and they're building schools, and they're using those funds to basically give young women, young girls, an opportunity to go to school. So that's a smaller concern. So it could be very large companies and it could be very small companies, right? Then I'll point out a UK company, for example. There's a beauty company called the Inky List, and they're a beauty company that makes skincare products. So really what they say is, we're here to promote knowledge and education. We're here to talk about everyday beauty, that every girl is beautiful. You don't have to look like a model. And, here's the education. Here's the self-esteem that we want to promote. And oh, by the way, we happen to have a product line that works. Okay, and it's a sustainable product line that uses plant-based rather than chemical-based, ingredients to promote a healthy planet, healthy skin, healthy complexion, but more importantly, it's about they point their brand to young teenage girls, maybe early 20s, when those girls are experiencing a lot of self-doubt, low self-esteem, and they're basically promoting the idea that beauty is about who we are, and beauty comes from within. It's not about how we look, but how we feel, and everybody is beautiful. And those are three examples of big and small of how business, can create good in the world.
Those are incredible examples. Thank you. Was the factory that Unilever created in Indonesia to create sustainably grown palm trees and palm oil ultimately beneficial for the environment as well as their own business? And did you think the Indonesian government appeared to be supportive of this initiative throughout the journey?
Yes, they were. So essentially, Unilever tried to partner with the government, and they were getting a lot of roadblocks. So they took the decision that, we'll just take matters into our own hands, and we will control the supply chain from the beginning to the end. So Semankai was chosen strategically because it's near the water, and you need to have that access to move product. It also happened to be an undeveloped jungle where palm trees were already being grown. So now Unilever was able to buy up that land, and they had control over the growth of those palm trees, right? So it's sustainable growth. You harvest a palm and then you replant, right? So it's a regenerative supply chain, if you will. So when they were harvesting the fruit, every part of the fruit was being able to get used for different things. And they used it for their own product line, but then they had a supply that they can then sell on the open market. So they created this virtuous supply chain where every bit of the palm fruit was being used sustainably, but then more importantly, they created an entire development of a village community, schools and hospitals and homes. They bought homes for the employees. And now, and of course, they were paying much better than average, right? So it created an ecosystem of people that were lifted up, and they transported those people, trained them up. It took a year to get people prepped before production even started. So it was a significant investment to be able to do this. And the bottom line, so this is, I want to say we're 7 years in at this stage. And yes, it's reaped significant benefits for them.
Thank you. So you've given us some great examples of where there were a true environmental impact and it was validated. So one of the audience members was wondering how we can measure and validate whether a company is making a real positive impact, or, you know, since ESG is such a hot topic, are they kind of just leveraging it as more of a headline to increase sales? How are you helping clients kind of like measure, or how have you heard in the industry we're doing that?
Yeah, so I actually have partners that I work with that specialize in creating the scorecards. So it really is very difficult to measure. And what you need to do is you need to figure out what the baseline is. And unfortunately, there are a lot of unscrupulous companies that do try and use this just to their advantage. Like, yeah, we're doing these things, but they're really not doing enough. So for example, if you start looking at what is your baseline, so you've got to measure your baseline in terms of what is your water consumption, as an example. How much, how much carbon are you emitting, by your process? If you're doing all of the right things, you need to start with creating a baseline, and then you need to track on a regular basis. Now, public companies are required to put this in their annual reports. Okay, there are entire businesses and consulting firms that have been created and hired by these businesses to track the environmental impact, from their actions. Now, social impact is easier. So, you start looking at DEI, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, you've got, that's all part of creating social impact. And how do you create that balance? How do you give opportunities within the hiring ranks of, and all of those things get measured through HR systems, as an example. So, just to keep the math simple, I have 100 employees, I'm targeting 50% female, 50% male. That's easy to track over time. But it's not just about hiring the numbers, right? Because nobody wants to get hired for the sake of getting hired, and filling quotas. However, I can tell you as a woman of a few years in age, I never, as a supply chain professional, where I've been in rooms and in meetings where I was one female sitting in a room of 20 people trying to negotiate a deal, and I had to play in a male world, I would not have wanted to be looked at as, oh, I'm going to hire her because she's a female. But what we need to do is we need to open up the ranks to give people an opportunity, and it's by creating that balanced slate. Right? So you just give the opportunity. We're not saying don't hire the right person with the highest qualifications, but if you give the opportunity to interview to enough people, You'll have to measure how many people came in. And these are KPIs, or key performance indicators, that are tracked easily by creating a baseline. So the social piece, as well as the environmental piece, you start with the baseline, and then you've got to track the impact, the reduction of water. So if I use, 1 million gallons a month of water in my manufacturing processes, I start with 1 million. So next month I reduce to 900,000. There's my improvement. If my goal is to get down to, from 1 million to 100,000, you can see how you track that. There's a lot of errors, and it is very challenging. Okay, so this is why I say, because it's hard, it needs to have a complete cultural shift, right? This can't be something that you do. It really needs to be in your heart as something you want to do and change behaviors. And the only way you're going to change the culture and the behaviors so that everybody embraces this is by incentivizing people. It starts with the top, and it has to work through the organization. And if I'm the CEO, and and I give my top lieutenants, my board, the edict that, okay, we will do this, but they're not on board, they're not sold, they don't understand the why it's important, the culture will never change. So you have to have a true commitment. And if people do not embrace the cultural shift, then you need to change the people and put in people that can truly embrace it, right? And a lot of companies are now hiring, chief sustainability officers or chief corporate responsibility officers, chief environmental officers. So this is becoming a board level initiative by hiring, the police, if you will, right? So these are the people that are policing the progress. But it's not easy, okay? It's not easy. It really takes a huge commitment and a true desire to want to make change and impact change.
How do you think public and private organizations can partner together to achieve sustainable development goals through supply chain management? Are there any best practices you can share from your experience? Like, for example, while working at the food bank, did you partner with private organizations to combat issues like food insecurity through improved supply chain management in local communities?
Right. Okay. So this is a perfect example. Food banking is a very local business. Okay. And I was in New York City, where in New York City, the financial capital of the world, there are 1.6 million food insecure New Yorkers. Okay. So they're food insecure. And these are not people that you would think, are living in shelters, or these are families. These are working families that can't generate enough income without having help. So, from a supply chain standpoint, I needed to be able to maximize the efficiency of my supply chain to get the food out, because literally overnight, we had a pandemic hit, and almost overnight, we doubled the demand and the requirements of people needing food. My resources didn't double. So what I had to do was to stretch my supply chain resources in order to meet twice the demand with the same amount of resource. So it was about a lot of training and a lot of education, and it was working with our agency partners to understand where the need was. And it was really about tight knit. At the end of the day, supply chain is never about technology. It's always about people and process. Technology is nothing but a tool. So you've got to have the right people who know the right process to be able to operate the tools. So that's how you have to think about it. And what is it? If it's about people, then it's about collaboration and partnerships and communication. So, myself and my team, we try to create those opportunities to collaborate with our agencies to find out where the need was. And then it was about, because you know that example of, if you want to feed someone for a day, you give them a fish. But if you want to feed them for a lifetime, you teach them how to fish on their own. This is the same experience, right? So what we tried to do at the food bank is, yes, you supply food, but then we started working on programs with other agencies. So we used the city of New York, we used the government of New York State, we used partners in
Дякую, дуже дякую.
women's organizations, hospitals, veterans organizations, and we partnered to create a communication campaign to break the cycle of poverty. So how do you break the cycle of poverty? And we concentrate on women because most of the people that are impacted are women and children. So when the woman becomes pregnant, you teach her about breaking that cycle of poverty. You give her skills training. You give her education. You enable her through education and training to be able to get a better job with better skills. So we did those non-food bank distribution type activities to be able to create those opportunities where you are breaking that cycle. And it's all about understanding the root cause, right? So in supply chain, we use a problem solving technique called 5W1H. So it's always about asking the right questions. And you're essentially asking 6 questions, 5 W's, 1 H. You're asking, what is the problem? Who is involved? Where is the problem? What's the location? When did it occur? Why did it occur? So there's your 5 W's. And then how? What is the impact? So if you do that deep root cause analysis, and that's a key to supply chain, right? If you get to the root cause, you can begin to put the right mitigation plans in place, to fix that. So you can always get more food, more donations to be able to give out to people. But does that help break the cycle of poverty? That's where you're asking the why and the who and the how and the what in order to break that cycle and create a less of a reliance on receiving food and more of being self-sustaining. And people want the dignity. People want the dignity of work, right? So one of my clients is a personal care manufacturer, but everything they do is in India, right? And in India, it's a female owner. She and her husband are both engineers, and they wanted to give back, okay? And their cousin happens to be a lawyer in the United States, and he is taking product manufactured in India and funding it himself to be able to sell here and bring back the dollars. But the thing that is about them is that they've got 350 employees, and they are all in this village, the hometown village of this woman's parents, where you got 350 women that do not read and write. They are completely illiterate, but they have employed them. And if you know anything about the culture there, it's very patriarchal. Women do not have the dignity of work. And, I was watching a video where these women, okay, so the youngest that was working was 15-year-old girl. And the oldest woman working was 75-year-old grandmother. And this woman said, they'll have to drag me out of this factory. And it's a very low tech factory. Everything is hand done. And she said, they'll have to drag me out when I die because I'm not leaving until I die. I finally realized the dignity of work, and I don't need to rely on my husband or my son to take care of me. I'm able to contribute to my household through her wages. Right? So it's about the dignity of work. It's about the dignity of being self-sufficient. And the supply chain enables that, right? The supply chain enables that.
We're reading in the news and also experiencing in our day-to-day lives the impact of widespread supply chain issues that have resulted from the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine. What is one of the largest and most serious supply chain issues we're facing today? I understand they're across the board, but are there any that would be great for some of the students who have joined today to be more aware of?
Yeah, so the pandemic was a big eye opener, right? Because globally, the goal of the supply chain over the last 25, 30 years has been low cost, low cost, low cost. Building economies of scale, leveraging our buying power as organizations. And it's been a lot of going to low cost labor and low cost manufacturing locations. So case in point, for the last 30 years, we were going to China because the cost of labor is cheap. We were going to India because labor is cheap, right? We were going to Vietnam and other parts of Asia. In the Western world, in the developed world, in Europe and in North America, you had a lot of outsourcing of back office roles, right? So customer service and accounts payable, and even in the medical profession, right? Radiology. So doctors are able to send their x-rays, to India, where it's cheaper to read them. You take the x-ray, it gets read in India and it's translated because it's cheaper that way. So there's that low cost supply chain model, and it was cut it to the bone. Okay, cut it to the bone. So there was no fat to trim. It was just meat and bone. And so the pandemic hit, right? And many of our businesses are not very resilient, which means they can't bounce back and recover. So you hear this term in the industry and in the news now. How do you build a resilient supply chain? How do you build an agile and efficient supply chain? So now what it's forced us to do, and what businesses need to realize, is the pandemic was a black swan event, but then it followed immediately with the war in the Ukraine, right? And Ukraine, by the way, is the largest source of neon in the world. Do you know how many manufacturing processes use neon? Right? So it's a huge disruptor. Forget about the economic and humanitarian impact. You've got an economic impact globally because of things that are tied to Ukraine. Companies are no longer investing in Russia, right? Because it makes practical and politically correct sense not to invest in Russia. Russia is a big economy, right? And so this is having an impact. So these are all the supply chain issues that are being created. And then you've heard about the lockdowns in China that have continued, and people that are manufacturing in China, we can't get the product out. So you've got these containers and ships that are getting stuck. And you've got this block of containers that can't be unloaded because we've got a shortage of labor. We've got a shortage of equipment. And so now, how do companies, start to recover from this? So what I teach my clients is that they need to run a risk management exercise twice a year that starts with what is their revenue. So if I manufacture products, and a lot of the disruptions, like for example, Dr. Durbak and I are both dealing with air conditioning issues today. So if I wanted to go and buy a new air conditioning unit, okay, or if I wanted to find a contractor who's going to come and fix my unit, I simply can't find them because we can't get labor, we can't get trained labor, and talent is a real issue, right? So what we need to do is we need to figure out how to protect our revenue base. So if I make water bottles, all right, and I make a series of water bottles, and 30, let's call it, 1 liter bottles are my biggest revenue source, and maybe I make smaller bottles or whatever, but let's say 80% of my revenue is tied into 1 liter water bottles. Well, I better look at that supply chain, and I better assess where every one of my risk areas are, where am I vulnerable, and I need to put mitigation plans in place. If I look at this, you know, what makes up this bottle? There's a metal insert in here. There's a cap that is injection molded. This is a white bottle, so therefore I've got white pigment. What I do, this is 80% of my business. Okay, I better protect it by understanding where every part of this supply chain is made. Okay, and then what do I have to do to protect that part of the supply chain? So if I'm a business, if I'm a customer, I want to be a customer of choice, because the power is with the supplier, not with the customer these days. So I can't, you know, we used to be able to push our suppliers to say, I'm going to pay you in 90 days. I'm going to pay you in 120 days. And now they have no cash to sustain their business. During the pandemic, the really smart companies were paying their suppliers immediately so that the suppliers had the cash to be able to go back and get product. So that's why collaboration and supplier partnerships, and why procurement is so critical to the supply chain, because you are building those relationships to get product out the door so that you can protect your opportunity cost, which is really your sales revenue, right? And when I talk about a resilient supply chain, a lot of people probably have heard in the news about this baby formula issue. So in the United States, there's only 4 factories that make baby formula. And Abbott, which happens to be the largest, of a brand called Similac, went down completely because of a contamination issue. So there was a situation where you had the whole factory shut down because you had bacteria infect the lines. So now you've got the federal government that's involved, and it will not get back online for many months. Okay, this happened back in February, and the soonest we will get back to production is in at the end of summer. Okay, that's how many months it's taken to recover. Now, the first thing I would ask, if I'm the US government, you know, the FDA or the USDA, is why are there only 4 factories, right? And then if I'm Abbott Laboratories, whose factory went down, I've got 1 factory, and I don't have a supply chain backup plan if my 1 factory goes down. So now they're like trying to cobble up. You've got the other 3 companies building as much as they can. But what you've created is you've created a shortage where infants can't get food. Mothers don't know where to get formula for their babies. That is the opposite of a resilient supply chain. And these are some of the issues. So it's not about how quickly can I manufacture. It's about the total ecosystem, right? The other thing that we're facing in our supply chains today is cybersecurity, right? So we talk an awful lot about Russia and the nefarious hackers that come out of Russia. So if you're using a wireless mouse, okay, if you're using a wireless keyboard, you've got hackers that can go in and infiltrate your IT infrastructure. So protecting the ecosystem of your supply chain, because if your supplier goes down, okay, then you're not going to get product. And so it behooves us to look at the cybersecurity and how do we protect that vulnerability, because that perpetrates many supply chain disruptions. This recently happened with Toyota. There was a cyber attack that put down one of their suppliers, and it impacted the economy of Toyota's production. So you start to see how all of these things are connected and how we have to really look at the total ecosystem of how to solve them. Right now, The supply chain issues are less of a concern. And, you know, Gartner just recently did a survey together with Deloitte, right? They conducted a survey asking CEOs what is top of mind. And supply chain is now less of an issue, partly because we've defined a new normal. Okay, we've defined a new normal and we're finding our way through it. We're recovering. We still have long lead times. We still have the normal disruptions, but by and large, we're getting by. The new concern now in this latest survey is cybersecurity. That's the next disruptor, right? Because that'll shut down entire companies.
Thank you for an absolutely wonderful educational presentation, Anna, and teaching us on the connectivity of supply chain issues and what is happening in the world. I certainly learned a great deal from the information that you shared with us. Thank you very much for coming, and we wish you continued success in your work. Thank you, Susie, for your excellent hosting, and we wish all of you a very good week. Goodbye.
Thank you all.